So the rate of perceived exertion. Now, originally, this was called the Borg scale. You should be familiar with that term, the Borg scale. The Borg scale, that Gunnar Borg created, and he used a scale that made the most, and you don't have a picture of this. This is the modified scale you have in front of you. So the Borg scale went from 60 being six being very light intensity to 200 being max effort. 6 to 20, pardon me, 6 to 20. He created the scale going from 6 to 20 on purpose because he found that it corresponded with actual heart rates. So that if you were at level 6 of very light intensity, odds are you were working around 60 beats per minute. And if you were all out maximal effort, odds are you were working around, if you were at 20, you were really at 200 beats per minute. That's why he created it. So the Borg scale is a rate of perceived exertion. It's a scale, and it went from 6 to 20. Okay, and it corresponded with actual heart rates. The downside was it was a little bit confusing. So people found that hard to go, well, 6, like I'm a 14 from 6 to 20. They found it a confusing scale. So then we modified it just to what we call our rate of perceived exertion, where we changed it from a 1 to 10. So it no longer corresponds with heart rates at all, but it's an easier scale to use. Because if you are exercising, and I said on a scale of 1 to 10, how hard are you working? It's probably pretty easy for you to come up with a number. So, as I said, Borg's research demonstrated that rate of perceived exertion scale that he had from 6 to 20 corresponded with heart rate, which also matched up with ventilation rate or ventilatory rate, oxygen consumption rate, etc. However, it was kind of confusing. So people were confused by it. So unless they had all the descriptive words to read, to simply call out a number was very hard for them. So they created a 1 to 10 scale instead. So there it is. So if I tell you I want you, remember, we keep talking about moderate to vigorous activity, right? That's what we want to get at. So I would want individuals exercising, if they're a beginner, at moderate activity level. So I'd want them at a 4 to 6 out of 10 for the rate of perceived exertion. So they would describe that as feels like they get exercise for hours and they're breathing heavily, but they can hold short conversations. Once they become more advanced, I would tell them they'd want to be at a vigorous intensity. So I would say a 7 to 8 out of 10. So on the verge of becoming uncomfortable, they're short of breath, but can still speak a short sentence. So that's how we use this chart. Couple pointers about this chart. It can actually be very, very accurate with practice. But initially, untrained women, especially women, will tend to rate their activity level higher than it actually is. So perhaps they're working vigorously and they might consider that to be very hard or almost max. So women, especially untrained women, tend to over predict how hard they're working, whereas men, especially untrained, well, not necessarily untrained men, but men and athletes will under predict. So they'll think they're going moderate when in truth they're working vigorous. So be aware of these. You could still absolutely use these scores, but this is where I use other things. So I might have a female that says that, oh, I'm working at very hard activity, and then I check her heart rate. And even though heart rate's not perfect, but her heart rate's really low, and she's able to pretty much have a conversation with me, well, I would know she wasn't working as hard as she perceived her. So, I'd educate her on how to use the scale. And with practice, this becomes a very accurate system. Talk test is another way. And this is as intensity increases, our ability to speak decreases. So during activity, participants should be able to breathe comfortably and carry on a short word sentences conversation. So if you have an individual that's exercising and they can't gasp out a single word, if they can't say anything, then it's going to be an indicator to you that they are working too intensely, that they need to dial back that intensity. So once again, if they're gasping or demonstrating signs of shortness of breath, they should reduce their exercise. So this encourages your participants to talk during the workout, well, more interact with them. So I will have an individual exercising on the treadmill, and I'll start to ask them questions. And if I ask them a question and they are just telling me a long story and they're going smoothly and they're not having any problem, it's going to indicate to me they're not working very hard. So I'll have to increase that intensity. Or if I ask them a question and they could barely blurt out the answer, then I need to dial things back. It sounds like an overly simplified system. It actually is a very effective way. It deals with that ventilatory threshold. So as intensities go up, our demand for oxygen at the working muscles go up, and therefore we need to start breathing much more rapidly. If we have to breathe rapidly, it's hard for us to hold a conversation. So this is a really great tool. And I like how it says at the beginning it should be used in addition to the heart rate or rate of perceived exertion. Use a combination. Check where the heart rate is. Make sure that's making sense. And check to where the rate of perceived exertion are. So like I said, if the individual is able to have a full conversation like I am, but they call themselves 9 out of 10 on the intensity scale, I would know that perhaps their understanding of the scale might not be correct. So I would know that if they could have a full conversation, that they're probably more like a 4 out of 10. So this is a chart I kept telling you about, okay? At first glance, it's overwhelming. There's a lot of numbers, a lot of words going on. But I'm going to encourage you and remind you that we are told that we want to be exercising at moderate to vigorous intensity. So forget the very light row, forget the light row, forget the very hard or maximal. Look at moderate to vigorous. And what it's going to do is it's going to give you different ways of monitoring things. You will notice that if you are using the Carbohydrate method, the recommended percentages with the Carbohydrate method are lower percentages than if you're just using age-predicted maximal heart rate. So if you were to calculate those both out, so noticing that heart rate reserve is lower than maximal heart rate percentages, they will actually still give you an N number that's pretty close. So maybe they both, by the time you plug those numbers and those percentages into the equation, they'll both come up with, say, 120 beats per minute or approximately. Okay, so they are different. And all you do in prescribing intensities, if you have a beginner, you would calculate for them. You'd look at this chart and go, okay, a beginner, I want to keep them lower intensity. They haven't trained for a long time. I'm going to recommend they work between 40 and 50% of their heart rate reserve. And I will calculate what 40% of their heart rate reserve is. I will calculate 50% of their heart rate reserve. And I will tell them that I want them to work in that range, what those numbers end up being. As they become more advanced, I'm going to take their intensity up. So then I might say, okay, you know what, you're now a fit individual. I want you to do a short workout twice a week in addition to what you're already doing, but we're going to take you for cardiovascular intensity. We're going to take it up. And now, let's say this time we're using percentage of heart rate max. I will do 220 minus their age, and maybe I'll tell them I want you between 80 and 90% of your age predicted maximal heart rate. And so I will calculate what 80% is, I will calculate what 90% is, and I will give them an answer. So you use this chart to know what the percentage range should be, and then you take the information from the participant to calculate what the actual numbers are. The other things that this will show is that if you're using the Borg scale at moderate intensities, you should be about a 12 to 13. On the rate of perceived exertion scale, that would be 4 to 6. If you're going vigorous activity, it would be 14 to 16 on the Borg scale. Rate of perceived exertion, 7 to 8. The talk test, so the breathing rate, moderate would be short sentences. So they can get out a short sentence, but they're not it's not the same thing as light where they're talking easily. Vigorous, now they're only getting out a few words at a time. They could still talk, but they can only get a few words. Okay, and then they give you an idea, even though it's not accurate. You don't use stuff like sweating or body temperature to determine whether it's moderate or vigorous. Those are inaccurate ways, but just in general, they're just telling you that the body's going to feel warm during moderate or very warm during vigorous. That most people, moderate might be a brisk walk, whereas vigorous would be jogging. Okay, so this is how you use a scale. Don't get overwhelmed by this. Keep this handy. This is a very powerful tool in prescribing intensities, because otherwise, if somebody comes in and says, how hard should I be working? Well, what are you going to tell them? How are you going to decide what percentage of intensity? The scale will tell you. So let's change gears a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about blood pressure, because blood pressure is a big concern. So blood pressure is actually the pressure of the blood against the inner walls of the blood vessels. So how hard the blood is pushing against the blood vessels. Your blood pressure will actually be different in different parts of your body. It's different, and we know this, during different phases of the heart contraction. So while the heart is contracting or beating, the blood pressure will be higher than when the heart is resting or in between beats, and it's lower. And we'll discuss that in just one moment. Also, under different environmental conditions and health conditions, your blood pressure can be affected. We measure your blood pressure cup using blood pressure using a blood pressure cup. So during contractions of your heart, which is called systole, so when that left ventricle is contracting to send blood out into the body, we call that systole. Blood is going to be pumped out into the arterial system, which greatly increases the volume. So you get that wave of blood coming through. So this results in an increase in pressure, and it's also the highest pressure that it will be experienced through the cycle of the heart. So this is your systolic blood pressure. The systolic blood pressure is the pressure in the vessels when the heart is beating. So it will be a higher number. During relaxation of the heart, which is called diastole, so that's when the heart is not contracting, so in between beats, this will be the lowest pressure because the heart's filling up. Okay, so the heart's filling up, the pressure in the body will be at the lowest, and this is called your diastolic blood pressure. So when you see blood pressure numbers, you see it's something over something. So 120 over 80, 120 is the amount of pressure that's occurring of millimeters of mercury, 120 is the highest blood pressure, and that's during the systolic blood pressure while the heart is contracting. The lower number in my example is 80, is going to be 80 millimeters of mercury, and that is going to be the lowest blood pressure because the heart is relaxing, it's in between beats, and blood is filling back up into the heart. So here are these ranges. So systolic over diastolic. It is outside of your scope of practice to be testing blood pressures, but you should understand the concept of blood pressure. So really, nowadays, we really don't want people going much above 120 over 80 beats per minute. So we prefer people to be lower. Once you get higher, risks occur. And the reason is that if your blood pressure is very high, that means your heart has to beat very hard and has to work very hard to push blood out into a system that already has a high pressure. So normal blood pressure, just in your mind, think 120 over 80 or lower. Okay, so systolic blood pressure when the heart's contracting is 120 millimeters of mercury. When the heart is relaxing, it's 80 millimeters of mercury. People will have them lower. They vary from individuals, and they're affected by age. It naturally increases usually as we age. By our body position, it changes with the amount of exercise we do, with our weight, with stress, etc. So hypertension is high blood pressure. Hypertension is high blood pressure, and we call this a silent killer because what happens is you don't know that you have high blood pressure. You don't feel anything when your blood pressure is high. You feel normal because you adapt to it slowly and gradually. And so that means if your blood pressure is very high, your heart has to work very, very hard. Your heart is a muscle, and after a while, it causes degenerative changes in your heart and your blood vessels. So unless you're getting your blood pressure checked, you don't know you have this. So how does our blood pressure respond to exercise? So you should know all of these different stages, okay? During exercise, while you are exercising, your systolic blood pressure, so as your heart's beating, will actually increase as intensity rises. Okay, so this is the rise in systolic pressure is a result of the heart trying to pump more blood to the working muscles. Okay, so your blood pressure will be higher. Your muscles are contracting. It's causing a resistance against the blood flow. Systolic blood pressure rises while exercising. Your diastolic blood pressure will actually remain close to the same. Okay, so your diastolic blood pressure. So in fact, when we're doing graded exercise tests, that's how it indicates to us something might not be going right, is that we'd see changes in your diastolic blood pressure, which we don't expect to see. So if asked during exercise, while you're physically exercising, your systolic blood pressure will go up, your diastolic blood pressure will remain unchanged. After you finish your bout of exercise, within a few minutes your blood pressure should return back to your normal values. Now, what's important to know is that regularly performed exercise, cardiovascular exercise, will result in a decrease in your resting blood pressure. So your everyday blood pressure will start to go down as a result of exercise. So in as early as 3 to 4 weeks after exercising, starting an exercise program, we'll actually find that your resting values are lower. So once again, during exercise, acute bout of exercise, while it's happening, systolic goes up, diastolic stays the same. Within minutes after exercising, they return to your normal values, and that over time, exercise programs will result in lower systolic and diastolic blood pressures, which is a very good thing. It means that the heart does not have to pump as hard. So a very important concept to understand is cardiac output. So cardiac output is the amount of blood that the heart will pump per minute. It is the product of your heart rate and your stroke volume. So how much blood your body will circulate per minute is a product of your heart rate, how fast your heart's beating, and your stroke volume, how much blood is sent out with every single beat. When we are deconditioned, when we're not trained very well, our stroke volume, so the amount of blood sent out with each beat, is low. It's not a very efficient, and that's at rest or at exercise. So I could be sitting here right now, and if I do not do cardiovascular exercise, my stroke volume will be lower. My heart is not going to be as efficient at pumping blood around the body. As a result, because I do not send out as much blood with each heartbeat, my heart rate has to be higher. Okay, so if I'm not sending as much blood out with each beat, my heart rate needs to be higher to get that blood to circulate around my body. Picture this like a bicycle pump, a bicycle tire pump. Okay, you could either do a large stroke volume, which would be a really large pump with each pump. Okay, you could do a large stroke volume and not do as many pumps or heartbeats to fill up that bike tire. Or you can move less effectively and do a bunch of little tiny pumps, so rapidly pumping very, very quickly, but you're not going through that full stroke volume. As a result, you have to do way more pumps. Okay, that's what your heart will do. It's going to send the same amount of blood around your system regardless, right? So how much blood gets sent around stays the same. But if you don't have an effective system, your stroke volume will be low, therefore your heart rate needs to increase. What happens when we exercise and start cardiovascular exercise is our heart becomes more efficient. It fills with more blood, and with each beat of the heart, our stroke volume increases, and it will send more blood around the body with each beat. As a result, our heart rate will be lower, because now you do not require as many beats of the heart to get oxygen around the body, because the system is more efficient. This is why our heart rate decreases with exercise. So our resting heart rate will decrease with exercise. Now, our maximal cardiac output the amount of cardiac output we can generate per minute will decline with age. When we exercise, so when I start an exercise, so I'm sitting here right now, my cardiac output, the amount of blood that I'm circulating, is at a certain amount, okay? If I get up and start exercising, my cardiac output will increase. So the demands of blood getting to my working muscles will increase, and it'll increase both as a result of a higher stroke volume, so my stroke volume will increase, but then my heart rate will still increase to send blood around my body, because my cardiac output, the needs for the blood around the body, are increasing. So we'll look at this a little bit more. So our cardiac output during exercise increases because we'll elevate how fast our heart beats to get blood to the working muscles. Our stroke volume will also increase while exercising. So really it's a combination of both of them. So with endurance training, stroke volume will show an overall increase, especially at rest, because of that endurance training. The heart became more efficient. That left ventricle, which sends the blood around the body, became more powerful. And that's why our resting heart rate will decrease. So really what happens is by doing endurance training and cardiovascular training, that left ventricle and that sends the blood out will allow for more blood to fill before pumping. And because it's more powerful, it can eject more blood with each beat. This is why our resting heart rate and our submaximal heart rate. So the same thing that when you are exercising submaximally, so you're not doing your max heart rate, that's why all of a sudden you could do more work. So let's say you're not trained, you're a deconditioned individual. I might have you walking, and at walking, your heart rate might be 120 beats per minute. So what will happen is if I keep you walking at that same pace and you become fitter, your stroke volume is going to increase. So maybe all of a sudden that walking at that same pace, now your heart rate's only getting to 115 beats per minute. Okay, because your stroke volume improved, so your heart doesn't have to beat that intensely. So as a result, if you tell people what heart rate they need to exercise at, as a result, that individual that was walking and getting 120 beats per minute, maybe now they have to do a brisker walk, a faster walk, or a speed walk to reach that heart rate. So see what I mean? So as you become fitter, you have to work more intensely to get to the desired target heart rates because your body's more efficient. It's better at doing what it's doing. Let's just change a little bit to the dyspnea scale. Dyspnea actually means bad breath. Dys is bad or negative. Pnea is breath, right? So it's a shortness of breath or labored breathing. This scale that you're about to see is used for individuals who have asthma or who might feel limited because of breathlessness. So they might have a hard time breathing. And it outlines for these individuals with breathing issues how to monitor exercise intensity. So here's a scale. At 1, they might be mild difficulty breathing. They could feel it, but nobody would notice it, right? At 2, if you're getting higher, so as an instructor, you would be able to see that something's wrong with the individual. Then it gets higher, that it's more difficult, but the individual could still continue. Or at 4, it's severe difficulty. The individual needs to go into a cool down. This is only really used, I'll be honest, I don't use a scale. Asthmatics would use a scale. So they'd be aware of that. And even though I might not use a scale number-wise, I would watch people with asthma in my class, right? So all of a sudden, they're having a hard time breathing. I have them decrease the intensity. All of a sudden, they'd be having severe difficulty, between moderate to severe difficulty. I'd get them to adapt what they're doing. Now on to another topic that at first is going to seem a little overwhelming, but promise you that with repetition, it will all make sense. This is energy production. So we've talked about needing to get oxygen to the muscles to exercise, but the other thing we need to have is energy. Muscles require energy in order to be able to contract. The energy is going to come from the breakdown of different fuels, okay? And so what happens is we consume food, we consume carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, and they go into our digestive system, and especially the carbohydrates and fats. These macronutrients are going to be broken down into glucose, into sugar. So fat and carbohydrate are broken down into glucose. We can do it with protein as well, but your body will preferentially not do that. It'll try to save the protein to use to build, okay? But it can, in extreme cases, you could also utilize protein for an energy source. It's not very ideal. So we'll talk mainly about carbohydrates and fats. So you've consumed carbohydrates and fats. You have broken them down into digestion. And we break it down. It goes from being carbohydrate and fat down to glucose, which is a sugar. And then that sugar molecule, that glucose molecule, will be further broken down to create adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate, ATP. And ATP is what the muscle will use to produce movement. So the muscle does not use fat to produce movement. It does not use carbohydrates to produce movement. It uses the breakdown of those two items. So you will consume those foods, you will break them down. All of them will break down eventually to be a simple sugar of glucose. And then glucose will be further broken down into ATP. The energy pathways that we are about to discuss, because there's different energy systems, will be what determines how we get that ATP. Either we will get it slowly and over time, which would be using your aerobic system, or will require fast, high levels of ATP to be produced very rapidly, faster than our aerobic system can produce for us, which puts us into our anaerobic system. Okay? Once again, these all come from glucose. Glucose is stored in our muscles as glycogen. We're talking about glycogen. And that is what we'll utilize to rapidly break down into ATP. So ATP is actually a high energy compound that's synthesized and can be stored in small quantities in the muscle. So you can directly store ATP. So while you are at rest, your body will make sure to fill up its ATP stores, the amount of ATP it could store in the muscles. Okay? When we break down this ATP, we'll release energy that can be used to fuel a muscle contraction. Okay? ATP can be used for membrane transport that's going across the cells, protein synthesis, so building, but the one we care about for our discussion today is our muscle contractions. ATP will allow muscle contractions. There are 3 different ways in which we can get ATP for activity. There is at the bottom the aerobic system. Right now, when you are sitting down, you are using your aerobic system. You're not stressing it. That's what cardiovascular exercise does, is it increases the demands. But as you're sitting down, your body is breaking down fats into sugar. So it'll break it down from fats into glucose. And it will break that glucose down in a process that requires oxygen. That's why it's called aerobic. It will break the sugar down until it becomes ATP, and the body will use that ATP. Okay, so once again, you are always using your aerobic system until you get into intensities that go so high that the aerobic system cannot produce energy fast enough. The aerobic system has an unlimited ability to produce energy. It goes on forever. It's what we use. While you're sleeping, you're using your aerobic system. When you're doing lower intensity activity, you use your aerobic system. But the problem is the aerobic system can be too slow. So all of a sudden, if I want to do sprints or lift heavy weights or run quickly or bike quickly or do something intense, jump or do anything powerful, the aerobic system cannot produce ATP fast enough to provide that to me. So that will lead me of using my anaerobic systems. Anaerobic. You'll notice it's the word aerobic with the AN in front of it. AN will mean not. Okay, it means not aerobic system is what we're saying here. It's the not aerobic system. And we have 2 systems, 2 anaerobic systems. One is called alactic, which means no lactate. The other one is lactic, which means lactate. We're going to skip the middle one for a second. We're going to go up to the top one. Okay? The anaerobic alactic system is also called our ATP-CP system. CP stands for creatine phosphate. This is the immediate energy pathway because this system is going to use that stored ATP that was already in the muscle. So remember I just said a moment ago that while sitting there, your body, when you're at low enough intensities, is going to store some ATP already broken down, all ready to use in the muscles. This system, all it does is use the stuff that's already there. It will use stored ATP and stored creatine phosphate in the system, in the muscles, to give immediate energy. Immediate. So this one is called the immediate energy pathway. It is used at the start of all activity. So right now when you're sitting down, if you were to stand up and go walk to your kitchen, as you stand up, you will initially pull some of the stored energy source. So you will use stored ATP just to stand up. And very quickly, the other two energy systems will kick in to provide you with energy. Okay? The other time you will use your anaerobic alactic or your ATP-CP system is during extremely high intensities, because you are going to be working at an intensity that no other energy system can get you energy fast enough. This system is usually for extremely high intensities that will last anywhere from 0 to 20 seconds. By the time you reach 10 seconds of extremely high activity, you'll find that your anaerobic lactic system, so the intermediate one, that one starts to kick in. But when you think of anaerobic alactic, you think the start of all activity it occurs at. And the other thing I want you to think about is very, very intense things. So when you are doing extremely heavy weightlifting, extremely heavy, you are using this system. So when you're doing near maximal lifts, you're using this system. When you are doing full out all intense sprints, so if you're doing a 100-meter dash, you use this system. You're not using oxygen for energy, because you do not need to break down the sugar molecules. You are using something that's already stored, all ready to go. The middle of the two systems is called your anaerobic lactic system. This system will use stored muscle glycogen, so muscle glycogen, or blood glucose, so sugars, and like the aerobic system, it will break down the sugar for energy. But this system will only break down that sugar molecule part way, because it's going to do it without the presence of oxygen. So you do not use oxygen. That's why it's called anaerobic in your lactic system, in your short-term energy system. What will happen, this system, so once again, the immediate one, you didn't do anything, you just use stores, okay? The second one now, we are breaking down glucose and glycogen for energy, but we're doing it very rapidly and we're not using oxygen. As a result, we get a byproduct that's called lactate. You may have heard of it called lactic acid in the past. We use the term lactate now. This byproduct of lactate and the hydrogen atoms, so the acidity of the muscles, will increase when you are in your short-term energy pathway, and it will allow you to maintain that activity for only a set amount of time before you get too much lactate buildup. Once you get too much lactate and hydrogen atom buildup, this system you have to slow down, and you come out of this system and you would start to use your aerobic system. You would slow down. So your anaerobic lactic system, this one's going to work and for activities lasting 20 seconds to 2, sometimes 3 minutes. This is a system that's going to require more oxygen, or more energy than the aerobic system can produce for you. So it's going to be high intensity, but it's not as high intensity as your immediate. So let's just look at this couple different ways, and then we'll go through some slides and discuss this all individually. So your ATP-CP system, your anaerobic alactic, is absolutely the fastest system. It allows you to do the most powerful activities, but it lasts the shortest time. Okay, because it uses up the stores and then you need to slow down. You don't have a choice. Your anaerobic lactic system is in the middle. This one will break down sugars, so it is slower than your anaerobic alactic. But because it's only partly breaking down those sugars, it will be faster than your aerobic system at providing energy. So these will be they're still high intensity activities, but these will be less intense than things that you could do with a full-out sprint, but more intense than you could do with your aerobic system. When you use your anaerobic lactic system, you get a buildup of hydrogen atoms and lactate. It increases the acidity of the muscles, and it forces you to slow down. So this system will only last for about 20 seconds to 2 to 3 minutes. Your anaerobic alactic, the first one, lasts 20 seconds max. And then finally, the last system is your aerobic system. It's always going. It produces the most amount of energy, of ATP, but it does it the slowest. So it's slow. So anything that requires a faster delivery of energy, ATP, will require you to go in your anaerobic zones. So here's this immediate energy, the ATP-CP. So this is for activities where the muscles need great speed, great power, great force, and can be activated extremely fast. It's just using up stored supplies. Okay? So small amounts of ATP and creatine phosphate are stored within the muscle tissue. This stored energy system is only significant for the first few seconds of heavy work. Oxygen is not used. And then I say 20 seconds. So for the most part, we talk about activity up to 20 seconds. But once you've reached about the 10-second mark, the other two energy systems start to kick in. This one will still predominate, but the other ones will start to contribute as well because you'll start to run low on your stores. This is also at the beginning of all activity. You will initially use this because you will do a movement. Your body hasn't had time to gear up your aerobic system to a high enough intensity. So it's just going to use some of the stores you have, and then you'll continue. So the next one is your lactate system. So this is when ATP has to be produced at a rapid rate for strenuous activity that continues beyond that 10 to 20 seconds. So when you're doing very high intensity, you're using mainly glycogen or glucose, and it's broken down without oxygen. So it's only partly broken down. So because that sugar, the glycogen, is only partly broken down, we have an end product called lactate, and we'll also have hydrogen atoms. And they're just noting here, as I mentioned already, anaerobic means without oxygen. So these first two types are anaerobic. You have anaerobic alactic, which is the immediate, means no oxygen, no lactate production. And this short-term one is called anaerobic lactic. So lactate is a byproduct of glucose metabolism. So as we break down the sugars. So when we need this energy very rapidly, because we're doing intense activity, so the intensity of the activity has to be up there for this to kick in, we will not completely break down that sugar molecule properly. And that end result is going to be lactate. We call it a byproduct. It's lactate. So lactate itself technically is not the big problem. So I have in brackets hydrogen. As we break down that sugar molecule, we end up with lactate and extra hydrogen atoms. Those hydrogen atoms are going to change the acidity of the muscle. And this is why this all happens. So lactate is not technically the problem. It's the increase in acidity that's the problem. However, as acidity goes up, so does lactate. And we can easily measure lactate with blood tests. So that's why we talk about lactate levels. Okay. So muscle and blood can only tolerate a certain level of lactate, or the hydrogen buildup. When that lactate levels, which means also hydrogen levels, get too high, you have to slow down to use your aerobic system. Okay? Because the acidity is going to change too much, and it's going to interfere with the signaling of the muscles so that you'll no longer be able to contract muscles properly. Your body will do what's called buffering. It will get rid of extra hydrogen and lactate if the levels are not too high. But once you keep pushing higher levels, you get too much lactate and hydrogen buildup, and your buffering systems won't help you. So when you reach this system, this is when your breathing becomes really labored because you're trying to breathe off the extra acidity, because we could use our breath rate to deal with acidity levels in the body. Our muscles start to feel very tired and heavy, and we're forced to slow down activity. So you've all done this. So if you go out and you start to run, and you run too quickly, okay, so you run at an intensity that's too high for you, what's going to happen? You might be able to supply some of your energy using your aerobic system, but you're going to now start requiring your anaerobic lactic system to contribute. So because the anaerobic lactic system's contributing energy, the glucose molecules that it gets the energy from are not properly broken down, and as a result you get a build up of lactate and hydrogen ions, and you are forced to slow down. So you've seen this. You go over a run, you go too quick of a pace, you cannot maintain the pace, you have to slow down. Now, even though we're going to talk about the time span in which this energy system happens, because if you are full out in the energy system, you'll only last 3 minutes. But in reality, if you're doing long sustained activity and you're doing it a little bit too intensely, you will slowly build up your lactate level. So most of your energy will come from aerobic metabolism, but some of it's going to be coming from your anaerobic lactic system. And as a result, you get a buildup in lactate, and the hydrogen atoms will go up, and you're forced to slow down. So you see this all the time with marathon runners. That's why anyone that's ever done a race, they always tell you don't start off too fast, because if you start off too fast, you're going to start getting a buildup of lactate, and you'll spend the rest of your body, or rest of your race, trying to buffer it out of the body. Okay? And so when you notice this happening, you'll have somebody slow down. That gentle movement will help to remove the lactate from the blood and muscles. I'll remind you that this is what we used to call lactic acid. So we used to talk about, oh, I got lactic acid build up. We have just realized a better term, and we as the fitness industry has realized that the better term is lactate. So can you improve that threshold? So can you improve the threshold from where you go from your aerobic metabolism into your lactate? So really, imagine going from a slow walk, and you're going to be going aerobic, and you slowly keep increasing the speed at which you go at. Once you start to get into a jog and maybe into a run, that's when you're going to hit what we call your lactate threshold. That's where all of a sudden you stop relying as much on your aerobic metabolism, so you don't use aerobic system for energy anymore, because you require energy too quickly. You start to use your anaerobic system. So that is called your lactate threshold. So really, we actually do lactate threshold training in order to train the body to buffer that lactate, to get more efficient at buffering that lactate. Buffering just means removing that lactate and hydrogen, okay? So really, this is that interval. So when you hear about the high-intensity interval training, high-intensity training, that is what we're trying to do. So what we do is we make the individual exercise at a high intensity. We cause a buildup of lactate and hydrogen in their body. So all of a sudden their muscles start to feel heavy. They have a harder time breathing. And then we take the intensity down, let their body recover, and then we repeat again. Okay, so this one they're recommending 60 seconds. If you're doing a high intensity, yes, 60 seconds. If you're doing lower, you might do intervals of a few minutes. But you're going to go high intensity, low intensity, high intensity, low intensity. And you're doing this to stimulate the production of lactate, and then so that your body can be trained to remove it. So our last one, and I've already mentioned this lots of times, is our aerobic system. So our aerobic system always works. If the intensity is lower, we will use the aerobic system. So low intensity activities, we'll use walking or jogging. Because we have enough time. We're going to preferentially use oxygen to break down that glucose molecule. We'll preferentially use our aerobic system because there are no negative byproducts, that it can last forever. This is why when we do activity, this is why we do it gradually in a warm-up. Because if I stand up and I've been seated, if I start doing a warm-up and I go too intensely, my aerobic system hasn't really had a chance to get up to gear yet, get up to speed, and I end up using my anaerobic system. So I get a build-up of lactic acid, or lactate, pardon me, I should use lactate, which forces me to slow down. So this is why we do it gradually. It's extremely important to understand that this is a continuum. So I already mentioned that marathon, that runner that goes a little bit too intense, and so they mainly use their aerobic system, but they use a little bit of their anaerobic system. We don't usually use one. We don't usually use one completely alone and preferentially. So right now you are using your aerobic system. If you were to suddenly stand up and quickly walk to the kitchen, okay, and you get up and quickly walk, immediately your ATP-CP system will kick in, your anaerobic alactic. It has to. It will always do that, okay? But then it'll kick in, and why it's kicking in, your anaerobic lactic system will start to provide a little bit of energy as your aerobic system is also trying to produce energy, and as it's picking up the speed and the rate at which it produces energy using oxygen. So you see you're using all three of them. But as your system steadies, as you're walking into the kitchen, then you'll stop using your ATP CP system, You probably won't need your anaerobic lactic system. You definitely won't have gotten a big buildup of lactate because your body would have buffered it away right away. And then as you're standing in the kitchen, you're back to using your aerobic system. So it's really a fluctuation. In the extreme examples, if you do full out intensity, you will use your anaerobic systems almost exclusively. When you talk about long distance and long duration activities, your aerobic system will predominate because we know the other systems wouldn't last that long. Okay? And then if you're doing, say, an 800-meter race, use this example, you're going to be using almost equal amounts of your anaerobic and aerobic. So that's what those athletes train for, is how fast can they run while still using some of their aerobic system, because it's that fine balance. If they do that 800-meter race too rapidly, they'll get too much of a buildup of lactate, their body won't be able to buffer it, and they'll be forced to stop. Steady state exercise, that's when the muscular exercise keeps pace with the production and removal of lactate and hydrogen. Okay, so it's always fluctuating. You'll have reliance on certain ones, less reliance on other ones. We do overly simplify it by saying the anaerobic alactic usually would be an extremely intense activity lasting upwards of 20 seconds. If you're continuing max intensity, your anaerobic lactic system will last, it really depends, but you'll sort of see 20 seconds upwards of a minute and a half to 2 minutes. As you go beyond that stage, you're going to have more reliance on your aerobic system. So it's important to note that the physical activity is going to be affected by your environment, okay? So we are really concerned about heat, humidity, and cold. Thermoregulation is just the ability of the body to regulate its own temperature to prevent your body from overheating or overcooling. When we exercise, we produce heat within the body, and we need to get rid of the heat. And there are 4 ways in which we do this. Radiation is when the heat is transferred from one surface to another, but no contact taking place. Conduction is when it's heated from one surface to another with contact between the two. Convection is going to be the transfer of heat between a surface and a fluid. Okay, so you use like being in the pool. And the one that we kind of care most about is evaporation. This is how we dissipate a lot of heat, and this is with sweating. So this is when a liquid is turned into a gas. And this is the sweating is the body's way of using evaporation to cool down the body during activity. So when you are doing activity, we will sweat to bring water to the surface, and then that water should evaporate off the surface. This is why humidity is a problem with exercising. If it's a humid environment that you are exercising in, we know that the air is already quite saturated with moisture. Okay, there's a lot of moisture already in the air. So because of this, when we sweat, it's harder for the air to take on the extra moisture from our sweating because it's already quite saturated. So we can no longer dissipate heat. So we tend to overheat in humid. So especially here in the summer, we find in these hot summer months that the heat goes up in the summer, but so does the humidity, which makes it very, very hard to get rid of that sweat. One thing that we could really recommend too is having increased air movement. So if it has to be a humid environment, if you have fans blowing, that will really help to force some of that evaporation to occur better. In the cold, we need to be very, very careful, that the individual does not get too cold. So while they're exercising within the cold, they're having to use a lot of resources to keep the body warm. Okay, so they have to use a lot of resources. The other odd issue with exercising outside in the cold winter is actually overheating, because what you're going to find a lot of individuals will do if they decide to go running outside, they tend not to dress properly and they overload their system so that they sweat, and yet that sweat can't dissipate anywhere, that heat can't dissipate. So it's a really fine balance that they're warm enough so that their body is able to keep them warm enough, okay, but that they're not overheated. It's really, nowadays they have such great clothing that can be worn that can really, really make a difference. And so take advantage of that so that you have moisture wicking kind of clothing so that when you're in the cold, you are still kept warm enough, so your extremities are warm enough, your fingers and your toes, but also that excess sweat gets wicked away. So there is hypothermia and hyperthermia. Hypo is too cold. Essentially, they're in the cold. Quite often their clothing can be wet. That's what really will cause the problems. You want to remove wet clothing. You want to warm their body slowly and really slowly, gradually. So you're not putting them in front of a heater. You're gradually increasing the temperature. And you take them to the hospital. You get them professional help as fast as possible. Hyperthermia is too much heat. So you want to remove them from the hot environment. You want to cool down the body. So if they are doing activity, you're going to have them slow down and stop the activity. You're giving them cool water, not cold, but cool water to drink in sips. You could use damp cloths. You could use a fan, coldness to the body to help bring it down. And then you are going to take them to the hospital. The answer for both of these is you take the individual to the hospital. Excellent. So this was another very long, intense chapter. Almost after this, you're going to kind of be on the home stretch where you're going to start to apply some of these concepts that you have learned, and they'll start to make more sense. Remember, read through your textbook, look at your study guide, and listen to this video again. Make sure you really own this information. So the discussion points is when you are completing or performing cardiovascular exercise, what happens to heart rate, blood pressure, stroke volume, and respiratory rate? Heart rate's going to go up. Stroke volume is going to go up because cardiac output will increase. The demands for blood flow around the body will increase. Your blood pressure, your systolic blood pressure is going to increase while your diastolic blood pressure will stay the same. And because you need to get more oxygen to the working muscles, or because you're trying to exhale off more carbon dioxide to change your acidity levels, your respiratory rate will increase as you exercise. Long term, so the chronic changes to exercising is at rest. At rest, your heart rate will be lower. At rest, your blood pressures, both your systolic and diastolic blood pressures, will be lower. Your stroke volume of your heart will be higher, not as high as it is as during exercise, but higher than an untrained individual. And your respiratory rate will also slow with exercise. So as you are rested, okay, while you're resting. Why is blood pooling dangerous and how to prevent it? Blood pooling is when the heart is going very quickly, and before blood pooling, you were having the muscles contract to help return blood to the heart. It's when we stop exercise suddenly, and as a result of suddenly stopping exercise, the heart still beats quickly, so it still sends blood to the extremities quickly, but we no longer have the milking action of the muscles to return the blood to the heart. The receptors that will tell us what our blood pressure is like are located around our heart and our neck. So if all of our blood starts to pool in our extremities, our receptors in our heart and neck are going to say, look, the blood pressure has dropped. Because blood pressure has dropped, we need to jolt the system. It'll jolt the system using norepinephrine, which is like adrenaline, if you could picture adrenaline. It gives a massive jolt to the heart to try to up that blood pressure. This can result in a cardiac event. This could result in a heart attack, a stroke, etc. Something bad can happen from this. We prevent this by doing a cardiovascular cool down. So we will decrease the intensity, decrease the speed, decrease the size of the movements until the heart rate can slow down enough that it can circulate the blood on its own. And then describe intermediate, short-term, and long-term energy pathways. Intermediate, you're using stored ATP-CP. This is sprinting, and it's also at the beginning of all activity. Short term is your anaerobic lactic. You are breaking down glucose, sugar molecules, but you're only partially breaking them down. You're not completely breaking them down. This is done without oxygen. As a result, you're going to get the increased lactate and hydrogen atoms, so acidity in the muscles. It only will last upwards of 2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes. It's going to produce energy quickly, but it's going to be a short-lived system. And the final system is going to be your marathon runners. This is your aerobic system. This is a slow system, but it can last indefinite amounts of times. We use it our entire life, steadily. So it's very, very slow, but unlimited resources. This is going to break down sugar completely using oxygen. Very well done. Thank you.